Government shouldn't be in the business of picking economic winners and losers, but that's exactly what North Carolina government does when it hands out targeted tax incentives and credits. One person who keeps track of these incentives is Donald Bryson. He's the North Carolina State Director of Americans for Prosperity. He recently addressed the John Locke Foundation's Shaftesbury Society on the theme Reverse Robin Hood, Corporate Welfare in North Carolina. Welcome back to the program, Donald.
Thanks for having me on. It's always a pleasure.
There are lots of things we could talk about in terms of corporate tax incentives, but we're going to get into one specific case that you found kind of egregious. Before that, though, let's remind people when we're talking about tax incentives, targeted tax incentives, corporate welfare, what are we talking about?
Well, we're talking about there are several types of programs, but generally speaking, they're talking about incentives where a company decides to move into North Carolina or even expand into North Carolina if they're already here. And then the state government, specifically the Department of Commerce, agrees to give them back so much money per job in a lump sum over the next 10 to 12 years. So in the case of like Credit Suisse, which is a Swiss bank that was already in the Research Triangle Park, they are expanding by 1,200 jobs over the next 10 years, and so North Carolina will be giving them $40.2 million as part of that expansion.
This is something North Carolina has been involved with for years and years and years. We got a hint on the campaign trail in 2016 that our now Governor Roy Cooper might have had a different philosophy about this?
I don't think Governor Cooper's philosophy has changed. I think he's misusing terms. What we have over and over again are quotes from Governor Cooper about just decrying corporate tax giveaways. It's a term he says over and over again: corporate tax giveaways, corporate tax giveaways. In fact, even when he vetoed the budget from the General Assembly this year, he talked about how the giveaways to corporations were just far too large. The problem is that the governor is using, when we cut the rate evenly for all corporations, when we treat Bill's Plumbing the same as we treat Bank of America with the same corporate tax rate, he says that is a corporate tax giveaway. However, he'll go off and give these special incentive programs or special incentive deals to specific companies, usually very politically connected companies.
And in fact, you have done some work tallying just how much of the actual corporate tax giveaways have been given out in the first 9 months or so of Governor Cooper's term. And what'd you find?
Well, there are a variety of corporate welfare programs in North Carolina, and they're all acronyms: JDIG, JMAC, 1NC. But if you take the Jobs Development Investment Grant Program, which is commonly called JDIG around Raleigh, and then the One North Carolina Fund, which are the two largest of these funds. If you tally up everything, all of the deals that the Cooper administration has inked since he came in office back in January, it comes to $125,835,000 that North Carolina taxpayers are on the hook for.
So that's $125 million in less than a year in the first year of office for this new governor.
That's right, which is sort of terrifying when you think about what the next 4 years or what the next 3.5 years could mean. But he's willing to give more than that. There was an article that came out in the Triangle Business Journal just last week where public records showed that he offered $540 million to Foxconn to move to North Carolina, but instead they took a $3 billion deal, which is just astronomical to me, to move to Wisconsin.
We are chatting with Donald Bryson, who is the North Carolina State Director of Americans for Prosperity. Donald, some people are going to hear us and say, wait a minute, if you have to spend some incentives money to bring these companies here, it means jobs for North Carolina. Isn't this a small price to pay for economic development? Why is it wrong to consider this just an investment that helps bring jobs to the state?
Because what these are essentially tax rebates. They lower the tax burden of companies that are moving here. And so people who agree that these things are good and will create jobs also agree that lowering tax burdens will create jobs. Well, if that's the case, then instead of picking specific companies that we lower tax burdens for to the tune of $125 million, why don't we cut the tax burden for all North Carolina companies equally to $125 million and see how the state grows in that way. And if we see how the state has grown since we first implemented the tax reforms in 2013, 2014, 15, 16, 17, our jobs numbers are phenomenal without bringing in very many of these large whales, as economic development people will call them. So, comprehensive tax reform and regulatory reform are much better job creators, much more sustainable job creators than these sort of incentive programs. But furthermore, if we are going to call them investments, I think there's a question of, if we're trying to get a return on our dollar and we're going to call them investments, then, why doesn't the state just start buying shares? And the answer is because it's not within the role of government to do that.
Now, another thing we have not yet pointed out is if one company gets a cash grant or a tax rebate, someone's paying for that, and many times it's their competitors, isn't it? It
is their competitors. Credit Suisse is a good example of that. It's a publicly traded, Wall Street traded Swiss bank. The fact that we're giving money to a bank that's joke enough. I'm going to leave that alone. But you have to think about we're North Carolina. This is Charlotte. We're the banking capital of the South, and so we've got Bank of America, First Citizens Bank, Cardinal Bank, the Bank of Granite, all of these homegrown North Carolina-based banks, BB&T, that are having to essentially fund their competitors' expansion in RTP. It's just not a fair business practice, and I think if a lot of companies start thinking about it that way, they're going to start raising a lot of trouble at the General Assembly.
Speaking of the General Assembly, we mentioned Governor Roy Cooper, who is a Democrat. The General Assembly is run by Republicans, and we can't really say that this is a partisan issue because the Republican-led General Assembly has supported many of these incentives as well, hasn't it?
Absolutely, and Governor Pat McCrory, who is a Republican, also gave away a lot of these incentives. This is not a partisan issue. This is an issue of what is good government and what is bad government. The problem is that with Governor Cooper in particular, and why we launched this initiative with reverse RobinHoodCooper.com, is because he had such a long quote line just over and over again. You would see in the press in North Carolina talking about how bad corporate tax giveaways are, but when it comes down to it, he's giving them out as fast as he can go, and would give more with the Foxconn example if he could.
If he were defining the term corporate tax giveaway correctly, you'd be right on board with him saying this is one of the best things you've done.
Absolutely. I would be right on board with him. The problem is that he is opposed to cutting the overall tax rate for taxpayers and instead wants to pick which companies get to expand and which ones don't. And it's just not a fair way to, one, use taxpayer money, and two, it's just not a fair way to treat businesses in our state.
You mentioned a website that details much more about this involving our governor and what you were calling reverse Robin Hood, the use of corporate welfare. Let's get that website again.
Sure. It's reverserobinhoodcooper.com, and it details all of the corporate welfare deals from JDIG and One North Carolina that to this date the Cooper administration has sort of signed and put taxpayers on the hook for. So, let people know it's all public information. Didn't take a FOIA request, but we just compiled a lot of information from the Department of Commerce, and people can view that at reverserobinhoodcooper.com, because essentially what he's doing is he's taking from middle class and working class taxpayers and giving to wealthy corporations.